Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our second session of the course on research ethics. By now, likely you have watched the assigned videos and perhaps even completed the TCPS tutorial. So, as you have or will see in the TCPS tutorial, research has not always been used for good or in just ways. Too often it has been used to harm and marginalize vulnerable people. And here's a quote from Indigenous scholar and activist Linda Tuahi Smith from her powerful book, Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples. From the vantage point of the colonized, the term research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. The word itself, research, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. The ways in which scientific research is implicated in the worst excesses of colonialism remains a powerful, remembered history for many of the world's colonized peoples. It is a history that still offends the deepest sense of our humanity. So we often think of research as meant to uncover and to help the world, but it has also been used in very destructive ways. So it's very important as we begin our journey into our own practices of research that we're aware of the past harms and the potential that research can do if it's not done ethically. You may know one of the most egregious and well-known examples. During World War II, a number of German physicians conducted painful and often deadly experiments on thousands of prisoners without their permission. These were considering inhumane conditions, lack of consent, and questionable research standards that were perpetrated on folks who were prisoners in concentration camps. And the experiments included unethical testing of drugs and treatments and advancement of real racist Nazi ideological views. So this is a photo here of members of Hitler's Third Reich at the Nuremberg trials after the war completed. And the atrocities, the full extent of the atrocities became known in terms of what happened in the concentration camps and what was done, the research that was done on folks who were prisoners in those camps. This trial took place to hold folks accountable, which was the Nuremberg trials. But only a few of these experts were really held to task. Most of them went on to continue their careers. So the research that was conducted, which was extremely unethical, was made known, but the consequences from the Nuremberg trials were unfortunately not widespread, and people who were part of these atrocities, both the research and the broader atrocities of the Nazi regime, often went without punishment. So that was, that was happening in a very clear context of power and abuse. But other situations in other places were also taking place around the same time in the United States. There's a real shameful malaria study that was being conducted using prisoner populations. So again, this prisoner population vulnerability. At the Stateville Penitentiary, researchers were breeding mosquitoes with malaria and giving prisoners bites, getting the prisoners to be bitten by these mosquitoes so that they would contract the disease, and then studying the process of malaria and also researching how to treat it through this population. And these situations were often seen as ways of generating knowledge to help people suffering. So I think that we can look with the vantage point of history and say, wow, these are things that we can't imagine researchers were thinking was okay and were allowed to do. But the idea was that these prisoners and their suffering was counted as part of their debt to society. So there was also this view that because they were prisoners, they owed a debt to society, and that we can use them to research, and then that knowledge that is generated will be a benefit to society. But of course, this is where we get into some really murky territory, where we justify bad practices and we justify inhumane treatment. And just because people are in prison doesn't mean they're not human beings. This research went on for actually 29 years, from the 40s to the 60s, this malaria research at Stateville Penitentiary, which was before, during, and after the World War II. So we have this situation where we're recognizing the atrocities of the research done in the Nazi concentration camps, but we're still continuing similar types of research in other places. During the Nuremberg medical trials, the defense attorneys for the Nazi scientists actually argued that there was no difference between the research they were conducting and the research that Americans were conducting. But of course, others argued that the level of severity was different between these two, between the concentration camps and prisons. But we are seeing, and we can see, as I said, with the vantage point of history, some similarities between these things. So, speaking of the Nuremberg trials, although everyone did not go punished, some folks did go without punishment. There was an attempt to learn from this experience and to create what's called the Nuremberg Code. So this was a code that would put in place a number of principles to govern research processes to ensure that research could not be used in these ways again. And so that is the principle of voluntary consent, principles of avoidance of physical and mental suffering, principles of terminating research if it is causing injury, disability, or death, and looking to make sure that there is skill and care, that research is being conducted by qualified people with skill and care, so not just with skill, but also with an ethical imperative to do no harm, and that the results should be used for the good of society, and this is very important, that they should be unattainable by any other method. So if we're doing something, especially something a little bit extreme, or more than a little bit extreme, to human beings, we should not have another way to get that information, and we should do the least risky way of getting the answers that we need to build things like treatments and other kinds of things that we need to do research to understand. So these are some pretty good ethical guidelines that came out of the Nuremberg trials. And yet, even after the adoption of the Nuremberg Code, these principles that I just spoke to, there were many ethically questionable research projects that took place in North America. So we have this attempt to set out a set of principles, but we are still ongoingly needing to ensure that they are adopted. And one of the studies that you would have heard about in the TCPS, and also that I provided a video this week on eClass, is this Tuskegee study of syphilis in America, where 400 poor black men, and this is important, they were black and they were living in poverty in Alabama, were recruited into the study of syphilis in order to understand how syphilis was transmitted and how it spread. And so they allowed people to get syphilis, and they allowed them to go untreated. And this study went on for many, many years, for decades. And at some point during the study, penicillin was discovered, and penicillin was very effective at treating syphilis. And yet the men in the study were refused penicillin, and they were prevented from getting any kind of treatment. So even after the Nuremberg Code was passed in 1947, the experiment still continued. So Tuskegee was a study that started before the Nuremberg Code was passed and continued on after, and was endorsed and condoned by the Center for Disease Control in the States, even after it was made understood that the principles of Nuremberg needed to apply to research. So it actually wasn't until 1972, which is relatively recently, and 40 years after the study had started, that the ethical issues were widespreadly condemned. So this is why ethics is something that we have to pay a lot of attention to, because these things get normalized, and then we continue to do unethical things until we can really kind of build a consciousness to recognize that there is a standard here that is being breached, that cannot continue, and that should not be allowed to happen. And here at home, sadly, in Canada, we are not, we are not immune, and we have our own history of research atrocities. And perhaps not surprisingly, these include research and unethical experiments that were done on Indigenous and Canadian Aboriginal people. There's well-known nutrition experiments that were done on Aboriginal children in residential schools between 1942 and 1952, where researchers were studying malnutrition, and they actually gave some children less than the daily recommended amount of milk and other kinds of foods to understand the impacts of being malnourished on young bodies. They also wanted to understand vitamin C and gum disease, and so they actually withheld dental care from some of the young people living in residential schools, and didn't allow the Indian Health Services dentists to visit certain schools. And the parents were not aware of these experiments, and even as children died, the experiments continued. So you can see that we've got prisoner populations, we've got war type situations, and we've got things like residential schools, environments where people have very little control, where people are in fact at the mercy of very powerful forces, and these are places where a very egregious research has taken place. So in response to terrible uses of research like these ones, and like the ones that you will unpack further, use from today's videos, or from this week's videos, excuse me, and from the TCPS, we needed to really develop a robust ethical code that builds on Nuremberg, but then it's also very importantly reinforced and enforced in research institutions. So we now have this Tri-Council policy statement on the ethical conduct of research involving humans, which is the TCPS, and which you will engage deeply with, and very importantly, which has three main principles that need to be followed for research with human subjects. Respect for persons, recognizing the intrinsic human being and the intrinsic value of that human life. Concern for welfare, which really means protection from harm and securing well-being, so thinking about risks and benefits of research, and also justice, treating people fairly and equitably. And fairness means treating everybody with equal respect and concern, and equity means distributing the benefits and the burdens so that nobody is unduly burdened by the harms. And as you can see in the examples we've just talked about, there are certain people who are unduly targeted, and that was completely inequitable. So respect for persons is the principle of respect, centered on the imperative that the decision to participate in research must be voluntary, it must be free of any kind of coercion or influence, and it needs to be informed and ongoing. So under this principle, researchers must consider the factors that can diminish or reduce autonomy. So we need to think about giving people full information to make their own personal decisions as to whether they would like to be part of the research. And sometimes we might think people have the ability to make those decisions, but we have to think clearly and very nuanced about what might diminish their capacity to make those decisions or what might influence the decision. So if we don't give them enough information, or if they have an incomplete understanding of the risks and benefits, then that is not informed decision making. If they are in a position where they fear that they might offend us if they don't say yes to the research, and often this can happen because researchers are often in positions of authority. So if they feel like they have to say yes because we have an authority over them of some kind, that can diminish the autonomy in making a decision about being part of research. And if they feel that their care or other quality of life issues are going to be affected, especially again if they're an institutionalized or sort of captive group, then they might feel like they have to say yes. So we need to be very careful, and in fact we need to avoid doing research in those circumstances when there is a power structure. There often is a power structure, and that is something we need to think about very carefully when we're doing research. And as part of this respect principle, we also have to think about individuals who might lack the ability to make their own decisions. So children, people with cognitive impairment or mental health impairment, these people, and there could be other folks as well, but those are kind of the two areas where they may not be able to make their decisions on their own behalf. Someone may have to make a decision for them. So usually in these contexts, we would seek consent from members, from people who speak on their behalf, who have the ability to evaluate the risks and benefits, because children may not have the mental development, and folks with mental health issues may similarly not be able to understand clearly what they're being asked or fulsomely. So in these contexts, we usually have guardians or other folks who are legally speak on their behalf. The other second principle is the concept of concern for welfare, which builds on the respect principle. Researchers should aim to protect the welfare of participants, promote the benefits as much as possible, and attenuate or moderate any risks that are involved. This means sort of balancing risks and benefits, and often risks are low risk, and we try to seek the most low risk form of research. Sometimes we have higher risk, and the reason we would do higher risk is because there's a strong benefit both to the individual and to society. So how do we do this? Well, we want to remove any kind of coercion. So we often very clearly say to people in research, you are not required to do this. It's completely your choice. It should be entirely voluntary, and you should have the right to exit or to end your role in the research at any time, that you are not required to continue with anything that you're uncomfortable with. So it's voluntary, and withdrawal is always possible without any kind of penalty to whatever you're doing in the research, but also penalty to anything else. So it's not going to affect the treatment you're getting if it's your doctor. It's not going to affect the education you're getting if it's your teacher. You're not going to be punished if you withdraw from the study. Ensuring privacy and confidentiality. This is something we do often in research. We make sure that no names are identified with the research participant. In qualitative research, this can get complicated because sometimes they're talking about things that will identify them. So it's not just their names. If we're doing interviews, we sometimes need to, if they refer to their street that they live on, or if they refer to the school that they're going to, or their workplace, we would want to remove those from the transcript when we're doing interviews so that people can't be identified, so that they can be private. So if we're reporting findings, it can't be identified who said what. And often we also provide some compensation. This can be specifically in the purpose of people who are taking time away from paid spaces, that, whether they're using time that they might be working in a job to do our research, then we would compensate them for that. Or if they are folks who are vulnerable for whatever reason and are experiencing inequities, then we try to provide some compensation in relation to the inequities that they experience. So if they're folks who are low income, then we want to value their time by ensuring that they get something to compensate for their time. And sometimes honorarias and compensation can happen in the form of financial contributions, or it can happen in the form of certificates for groceries or food or other kinds of things that would provide some kind of reward or sort of compensation to people who are involved in research. Not so much a reward, really a compensation or a recognition of their time and expertise. So participants need to get enough information, and this is where our consent processes in research really come into play, to be able to make the decision about whether the risks versus the benefits are in their interest and whether they want to be part of the research. So to adequately assess risks and benefits. And this requires, really a strong process of consent. And so you hear this word consent that comes up a lot in research, and these are the things that didn't exist in these bad examples that we've talked about. Where folks did not have a choice about whether they were involved in this research. So this process, if this is the main thing to take away from research ethics, is that the concept or the need for informed consent is imperative to our research processes. It is the principle of making a voluntary, informed, and ongoing decision to participate in research. And ongoing, meaning, again, you make sure that the consent is consistent throughout the process. If at any point people don't consent, then they can withdraw from the research, or you should not have them stay in research if they are no longer comfortable being there. So this is a real cornerstone of research ethics, and it involves at the very outset of the process of conducting research, before any of the actual data is collected or any of the research is conducted, a consent process is completed where you discuss at length with the participant the goals of the study, the risks and benefits, and you get a very clear consent. Usually this is in the form of a signature on a consent form that the participants are comfortable and agreeing to be part of this research. And this really, again, requires providing sufficient information and full information, and also in a way that's understandable. So we need to think about making language accessible, avoiding any kind of jargon or anything like that, so that they can make a real informed judgment about participation. And then the final principle is sort of the general principle of justice. And again, we've seen in these examples that there are groups that are vulnerable often, that are not treated with justice in research. So we need to be really careful and ask ourselves very critically if any groups are over or underrepresented in research, because this can happen, injustices can happen, and in the examples I think there's very clear, because vulnerable people are targeted, whether they're prisoners or whether they're folks with less power, such as women or people who are in minority groups. So they may be experiencing imbalances in relation to broader structures of power, and so they're vulnerable and they get targeted for doing research. And again, often because it's deemed acceptable to do research because it's going to benefit others, but they themselves are experiencing injustices in that research. Also, if people are underrepresented, a lot of research done now is done on folks who are in a sort of a majority group or an accessible group, and then less representation is now. So we often see, for example, research done on men or men who are in wealthy positions. And so we don't have as many women represented in research. We don't have as many people of color sometimes represented in research. This is pretty typical of research that's done, say, on drugs and other kinds of things. So we often find that we don't know the impacts of these things on the underrepresented groups. If something is deemed to be safe and acceptable as a treatment, but we don't know how it impacts women versus men, that might actually cause a lot of problems and create some injustice, because we don't actually have proof that it's safe for other groups. We're generalizing, and we have underrepresented groups in the research. So this is really the importance of reflecting on power dynamics and the importance of reflecting on who is represented in research and why are they represented. And is there people who are vulnerable based on certain power differentials that are in the research? And perhaps we, for very good reasons, want to do research with vulnerable groups. But in these situations, we need to make sure that there is a benefit for those groups, and that we're doing that research to benefit them as individuals and as communities, and ensuring that there are equitable impacts of the outcomes of the research for participants, and not just for the researchers or for the institutions doing the research. And there's one branch of qualitative research called participatory action research, and that's the branch of research or the type of research that I have been involved in and continue to find to be a very powerful kind of research. And in participatory action research, the concept of partnering with community members is really central. So rather than being an external researcher who defines the research and who decides why the research is happening, what the research questions are, and how we do the research, in participatory action research, you work with community members. So you work with the people experiencing the challenge or the social issue that you're exploring, and you set up the research from the beginning with them. So they help to design the research. The research is often created to answer the questions that they have, because they know the problems better than anybody. So they know how to ask questions about those problems, or they know how to define the question from their own lived experience. And then we often work with this partnership model to conduct and to disseminate the research. So this is a particular explicit attempt to do research that is centered on justice. Again, it's a growing and very sort of qualitative orientation to research, which we will talk about more throughout the course, and we'll bring some examples into effect. So I'll wrap up by really centrally focusing in on this idea of equitable distribution of research outputs. So we want to make sure we disseminate research results, that we don't just do it to further our own careers, that knowledge goes into the public domain, that it's actually imperative and part of the research process to present and publish research, but not just in places that are accessible to people in institutions of higher education or institutions of research, but to make sure that those findings find their way to policymakers, to other kinds of decision makers, to disseminate this new knowledge broadly, and in particular to make sure that it comes back to the communities and the groups and the individuals who were the targets of the research in a way that they can use and that is respectful of their needs. Again, too much research is done without actually communicating the results back to the core participants and communities. So this is growing imperative in qualitative research to ensure that the research is getting back into the places which were the targets of that research, so that they can use the answers and the findings to address the issues that they themselves articulated during the process of research. So this imperative to promote good, do no harm, and increasingly to use research as a force for addressing inequities and injustices. I think I'll end there. I hope that this sort of captures or encapsulates some of the stuff that came up in the tutorials and in the other videos and the TCPS tutorial. We will have another Zoom lecture at 11:30 on Monday. And that is the day that your TCPS certificate is due. And then at 11:30, we'll go on to Zoom. And that session, I will present some dilemmas. So we'll get into some examples during our Zoom session on Monday, the 18th, in which I will present to you some ethical dilemmas, because you often think, oh, for sure, I would not do any of these things. But then when you get into the real world messiness of research, stuff starts to get a little bit more unclear as to how to navigate these principles. So I'm going to present some real life examples, and we as a class are going to decide what would we do, how would we address this, and what is the ethical way to deal with some of these dilemmas. So I look forward to seeing you then, and thank you for your attention.